Samuel Reed had spent his entire life on the farm. It had been in his family for generations, passed down from father to son, a legacy built on sweat and soil. Samuel had come to love the land, and he knew it better than anyone else. He knew every tree along the edges of his fields, every stubborn rock that had refused to be moved, every section of soil that gave him trouble when planting his crops. But Samuel was a man of routine. Farming was hard, back-breaking work, and his mind was consumed by it. He didn't make time for fanciful thoughts or superstitions, there was simply no room for them in his life. However, when strange things began happening, even Samuel couldn't deny that something was wrong. It all started with the tools. At first, it was easy to dismiss. He would leave a shovel leaning against the barn, only to find it inexplicably placed near the edge of his field the next morning. His pickaxe, which he always left in the shed, was found lying in the middle of the driveway. At first, he laughed it off, blaming it on his aging memory. He was a busy man, he had a lot on his plate, and perhaps he was just forgetting where he placed things. But then the occurrences grew more frequent. The hammer was placed, unnervingly, on top of a fence post. The wheelbarrow was nowhere to be found in the barn one evening and mysteriously appeared beside the well the next morning. Then the animals began acting strangely. His cattle, which had always been placid and dependable, began to refuse going into the northern pasture. Samuel thought perhaps the fence had been damaged, or maybe there was a predator nearby. But when he checked, the pasture was untouched. There were no signs of animals, not even tracks in the dirt. The cows simply stood at the fence, eyes wide with panic, their lowing desperate and fearful. His dog, Rufus, a scrappy mutt that had been his companion for years, was acting even stranger. The dog, who usually bounded toward the barn at the slightest sound of Samuel's voice, refused to go anywhere near it. He would stand at the edge of the barnyard, ears flattened, tail tucked, growling at the empty air. Samuel tried to coax the dog inside with treats, but Rufus wouldn't budge. He seemed terrified, eyes wide and darting, as if he saw something Samuel couldn't. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last vestiges of light vanished, Samuel heard something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A whispering. At first, it was faint, barely a murmur in the wind. But as he stood by the porch, staring out at the darkened fields, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. He couldn't make out the words, but there was a chilling tone to the sound, something almost pleading. It seemed to be coming from the northern fields. Just the wind, Samuel muttered to himself, shaking off the feeling of dread creeping into his chest. He had been working long hours and had been under stress lately. Maybe it was just the rustling of the corn, or the trick of a tired mind. After all, he was a practical man, a farmer, not a man who believed in ghost stories or old folk tales. But the following morning, Samuel was confronted with something that made it harder to brush off. His crops, those he had so carefully planted and nurtured, were withered. The corn stalks had turned an unnatural black, their leaves curling in on themselves like they were burned from the inside. The beans, which had been thriving, had shriveled and died overnight. There was no sign of disease. The ground was dry, but there was no explanation for what had happened. Samuel kneeled in the field, running his fingers through the soil, trying to understand. The earth felt unnaturally warm, too warm for a cool autumn morning. He rubbed the dirt between his fingers, trying to make sense of it, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt an unease crawl up his spine. It was like the soil itself was sick, tainted. Pushing the thought aside, Samuel continued his work, burying the unease as best he could. He was a man of action, and there was work to be done. But as the days passed, more strange things began to happen. He would open the barn door to find it empty, but as he stepped inside, the scent of something old, decayed, lingered in the air. The shadows in the corners of the barn felt deeper, thicker, as though they were watching him. It wasn't until the dreams started that Samuel began to worry. They came every night, dark figures standing at the edge of the field, staring at him with hollow eyes. In his dreams, they would reach for him, hands like gnarled roots, pulling him toward the earth. He would wake, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, but no matter how much he tried to shake off the fear, it stayed with him. It was a gnawing presence, always lurking in the back of his mind. And then, one night, it happened. Samuel woke to find his bedroom door wide open. He was certain he had locked it before bed. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he sat up, straining to listen. The house was silent, but he felt an overwhelming presence in the air, a coldness, a heaviness. He grabbed the shotgun beside his bed and crept slowly towards the door, his heart thudding in his chest. "Who's there?" he called, his voice hoarse, his hand trembling on the doorframe. No answer. Samuel swung the door open with a sharp motion, his eyes scanning the hallway. Nothing. He stepped slowly into the hall, his breath shallow, but all was still. The silence was thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Samuel took a few tentative steps forward, but as he did, the temperature dropped. He could see his breath in the air, cold as ice. Something was wrong. As he turned to head back to his bedroom, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, methodical, began to echo down the hall. His heart hammered in his chest as he spun around, shotgun raised. "Who's there?" he shouted again, his voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. And for a moment, all Samuel could hear was the beat of his own heart. But then, the presence became stronger. He could feel it, something unseen, something old, standing at the end of the hall. He didn't wait. His heart was racing as he clutched the shotgun, and as he moved down the dark hallway, a sense of dread slowly crept in, overwhelming his need for action. The house seemed to be holding its breath, the air too still. As he reached the stairs, the floor beneath him groaned softly, a low tremble he couldn't quite place. He paused, listening to the unnatural silence, his grip tightening on the gun. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Just the eerie stillness of the house. After what seemed like an eternity of silence, Samuel let out a sigh, and let the shotgun fall to his side. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, again. After all, there had been no real signs of danger, nothing physical, just that lingering sense of something being wrong, something unseen, just beyond the shadows. He dragged himself back to his room, deciding to try and sleep it off. Whatever was going on, he'd deal with it in the morning. The next morning, Samuel went out to the north pasture, where he felt the disturbance was the strongest. There was something about that land, something wrong. It had always been a little too quiet there, too still. An unsettling aura seemed to surround that particular field, ever since he was a young boy. As he dug into the earth, deeper and deeper, his shovel hit something hard. It couldn't be a rock, he knew that sound well, this was something different. As he pulled the object free from the dirt, Samuel unearthed what he realized to be a human skull, stained dark with age. As he pulled it free from the dirt, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. A low, guttural whisper rose from the earth, crawling into his ears, winding through his mind like a centipede. "You disturbed us." The whispering grew louder, no longer faint murmurs, but insistent voices that swirled around him, sinking deep into the depths of his mind. The words were unintelligible at first, but then they became clearer, colder, more demanding. "You disturbed us." They turned into anguished wails, the tortured cries of the long-buried, rising from the soil, voices that had been silenced by centuries of darkness, now filled with rage and torment. The cries were deafening, as though the ground itself was weeping for the souls it had claimed. Samuel stumbled back, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His pulse quickened, thundering in his ears, as panic began to claw at him. His legs trembled beneath him, but still, he forced himself to turn, to run, desperate to escape the horrifying symphony of voices that surrounded him. But as he took a step, the ground beneath his feet trembled violently. A crack appeared, deep and jagged, splitting the earth wide open and cutting off his escape. The noise was deafening, an unnatural, groaning sound, like the earth itself was being torn apart. Before he could react, thick, gnarled roots erupted from the earth, coiling around his legs like cold, unforgiving chains. They tightened with unnatural strength, and began pulling him down slowly, inch by inch. His legs were bound, unable to move, as the roots wound around his body, dragging him deeper into the soil. The air turned frigid, heavy with the stench of decay. Samuel struggled, his arms flailing, but the roots only tightened their grip, pulling him lower into the ground. The more he fought, the more the earth seemed to consume him, the roots creeping upward, entwining around his torso, his chest, holding him fast. From the depths of the earth, the whispers rose, growing louder and more anguished, the voices of the long-buried spirits calling out from below. Samuel's heart beat so loudly that it seemed to add a thunderous percussion to the symphony of spiritual wails. The roots dragged him deeper, pulling him into the very heart of the land he had worked his entire life. His body was no longer his own, the farm that had once sustained him now holding him with an iron grip. With each passing moment, the world above him faded away, and he was swallowed whole by the darkness, consumed by the very land he had spent his life tending. The next morning, the farm stood silent. The crops rotted where they grew, the barn doors creaking in a stillness too heavy to be natural. Samuel Reed was never seen again.